The Sahara does not forgive, and it certainly does not care for the ambitions of men. In the spring of 1941, the North African desert was a furnace of shifting glass and blinding light, a place where the concept of a front line was as fluid as the sand itself. For the men of the Afrika Korps, life was a cycle of grit in the teeth, the metallic temps of lukewarm water, and the constant, vibrating hum of diesel engines. But for their commander, the desert was something else entirely. It was a blank canvas. It was a place where a soldier could still find glory without the suffocating stench of the trenches or the political filth of Berlin. Erwin Rommel was a man who lived in the wind. He did not lead from a chateau in the rear. He led from the hatch of a panzer, often so far forward that he could see the expressions on the faces of the British gunners through his binoculars. He was a creature of impulse and instinct. To his soldiers, he was a god who shared their heat and their hunger. To his enemies, he was the desert fox, a ghost who appeared where he wasn't supposed to be and vanished before the trap could close. Rommel loved the desert because it was a war without hate. There were no civilians to slaughter in the sand, no ancient cities to turn into rubble. It was a clean game of chess played with steel and blood. Or so he chose to believe. While Rommel was outrunning the British Eighth Army, a different kind of war was being won in Berlin. Joseph Goebbels, the architect of the Nazi lie, had found his perfect leading man. Rommel was young, he was handsome in a rugged Germanic way, and most importantly, he was an outsider. He wasn't one of the old guard Prussian aristocrats who looked down their noses at Hitler. He was a commoner who had risen through merit. The propaganda ministry turned Rommel into a secular saint. Every victory was magnified. Every setback was hidden. They created a version of Rommel that was more myth than man, a hero to keep the German public distracted from the freezing, stagnant slaughterhouses of the Eastern Front. Rommel knew he was being used, but the ego is a powerful thing. He enjoyed the letters from schoolgirls and the praise from the Führer. He didn't yet realize that once you become a myth, you no longer belong to yourself. You belong to the regime, and the regime is a jealous master. Hitler's affection for Rommel was genuine, or at least as genuine as a sociopath's affection can be. Rommel represented everything Hitler wanted his generals to be: aggressive, loyal, and unburdened by the traditional rules of war. Hitler showered him with decorations, the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, the Field Marshal's baton, but the relationship was built on a foundation of sand. Rommel believed he was fighting for Germany. Hitler believed Rommel was fighting for him. For a long time, the interests of the two men aligned, but the desert, which had given Rommel his fame, was about to demand a price he couldn't pay. The cracks began with a simple word: logistics. Rommel was a master of the move, but he was a novice of the supply line. He pushed his Afrika Korps to the very gates of Egypt, but his tanks were running on fumes. He begged Berlin for more fuel, more ammunition, more planes, but Hitler's eyes were fixed on Moscow and Stalingrad. To the High Command, North Africa was a sideshow, a distraction. Rommel began to see a terrifying pattern. Hitler was obsessed with the idea of victory, but he was indifferent to the reality of the soldier. Rommel would spend his nights staring at charts, realizing that he was being asked to perform miracles with nothing. The propaganda hero was being left to die in the sun because the propaganda machine had found newer, bloodier stories to tell in the East. In the silence of the Libyan night, Rommel began to write, not just military reports, but letters to his wife, Lucy. In these private moments, the mask of the desert fox slipped. He wrote of the madness of the orders coming from Berlin. He wrote of the criminal waste of his men's lives. He was starting to see Hitler not as a savior, but as a gambler who didn't know when to leave the table. This was the birth of the betrayal. It wasn't born out of a sudden moral epiphany about the Holocaust. Rommel, like many, remained largely blind to the systemic horrors of the SS, but out of a professional's rage at an amateur's incompetence. He realized that the man he had admired was leading Germany into a grave. And as the British prepared their counterattack at El Alamein, Rommel knew that the real enemy wasn't just across the wire. The real enemy was the man who had given him his baton. Then came El Alamein. The British, under Montgomery, unleashed a wall of fire that the Afrika Korps simply could not withstand. Rommel, realizing the battle was lost, ordered a retreat to save his remaining men. But Hitler intervened. He sent a telegram that would haunt Rommel until his last breath. The order was simple: no retreat. Victory or death. It was a death warrant for the Afrika Korps. For the first time, Rommel disobeyed. He prioritized the lives of his soldiers over the ego of his Führer. He saved what he could, but the spell was broken. The Desert Fox was no longer Hitler's golden boy. He was now a man with a secret, a man who had realized that to save the army, he might have to destroy the leader. The journey from the hero of the sands to the martyr of the resistance had begun. By 1944, the sun that had defined Erwin Rommel's legend had set, replaced by the grey, suffocating damp of northern France. The Desert Fox was gone. In his place was a man tasked with defending a continent against an invasion that everyone knew was coming, but no one could predict. Hitler had sent his favorite general to inspect and complete the Atlantic Wall, a supposedly impenetrable line of fortifications stretching from Norway to the Pyrenees. But when Rommel arrived, he didn't find a wall. He found a series of disjointed points, a half-finished facade of propaganda that crumbled under the slightest scrutiny of a professional soldier's eye. Rommel realized with a visceral shock that Germany was no longer the hunter. Germany was the prey, and the Atlantic Ocean was not a barrier, but a highway for an industrial machine so vast it made the Afrika Korps look like a collection of toys. Rommel became a man obsessed. He spent 16 hours a day in his staff car, racing from beach to beach, demanding more mines, more concrete, more steel. He knew the mathematics of 1944 better than the madman in the wolf's lair. He understood that the moment the Allies established a single, solid foothold, the war would be over. The German army, bled dry in the Russian snow, could not win a war of movement in the West against the total air superiority of the Americans and the British. The first 24 hours will be decisive, he told his staff. For the Allies, as well as for Germany, it will be the longest day. But as he poured his energy into the sand and concrete, he was also hitting a wall of a different kind, the wall of Prussian arrogance. He clashed with Field Marshal von Rundstedt, the senior commander in the West, who believed in a flexible, mobile defense. Rommel, the master of the Blitzkrieg, knew better. He knew that any German unit that tried to move in the daylight would be incinerated by Allied bombers. He was a general shouting into a void, trapped between a Führer who demanded the impossible and a high command that refused to see the reality of modern war. It was in this atmosphere of impending doom that the shadow found Rommel. For years, a small, courageous circle of German officers and civilians had been plotting to remove Hitler from power. They were men like Henning von Treason and Klaus von Stauffenberg, men who realized that Hitler was no longer a leader. but a terminal disease for the German nation. But they needed more than a balm and a plan. They needed a face. They needed a hero whom the people loved and the common soldier would follow. They turned their eyes toward the Desert Fox. In the spring of 1944, Rommel's chief of staff, Hans Speidel, began the dangerous work of feeling out the field marshal's soul. They didn't talk about democracy or ideology. They talked about the end. Speidel spoke of the unnecessary destruction of Germany and the criminal madness of continuing a war that was already lost. Rommel listened. He didn't report Speidel to the Gestapo. He didn't shout for his arrest. In the code of a military man, that silence was a monumental act of treason. The psychological toll on Rommel was devastating. He was a man of simple, soldierly honor, now living in a world of mirrors and daggers. Every time he spoke to Hitler on the phone, every time he received a new medal, he felt the weight of the secret he was carrying. He was torn between his oath of loyalty to the state and his duty to the survival of the German people. He was starting to see the true face of the regime he had helped build. He saw the Nohart under Nebel, night and fog decrees, the disappearances, and the sheer, senseless cruelty of the SS. He began to realize that the war without hate he thought he was fighting was a lie. He told his friends, "I am a soldier, and I believe I have always been a good one. But now, to be a good soldier, I must be a bad citizen." He never fully committed to the assassination. He was a man who loathed the idea of a murderer's peace, but he agreed that Hitler must be arrested and brought to trial. The Desert Fox was no longer just defending Normandy. He was waiting for the moment to turn his tanks around and march on Berlin. While Rommel plotted, the Gestapo watched. Heinrich Himmler's secret police had a sixth sense for betrayal, and the Rommel circle was beginning to leak. They noticed the secret meetings, the late-night visits from suspicious officers, and the field marshal's increasingly pessimistic reports to Berlin. Hitler's inner circle, Bormann, Goebbels, and Himmler, were beginning to poison the Führer's mind against his golden boy. They whispered that Rommel was a defeatist, a man who had lost his nerve in the desert. Hitler, whose paranoia was already reaching a fever pitch, began to look at his favorite general with new, suspicious eyes. The relationship that had sustained the German propaganda machine for years was now a powder keg. All it needed was a spark. In early June, the atmospheric pressure reached its breaking point. Rommel, convinced by a meteorologist that the weather was too poor for an Allied crossing, decided to take a short leave. He wanted to go home to Germany for his wife Lucy's birthday. It was a rare moment of human vulnerability for a man who had lived his life in a uniform. He bought a pair of handmade shoes in Paris as a gift. He boarded his car on the morning of June 4th, leaving Normandy behind. He believed he had time. He believed the Atlantic Wall would hold. As he drove through the French countryside, he was a man momentarily at peace, unaware that the largest fleet in human history was already beginning to move through the English Channel. The Desert Fox was leaving the front just as the blow he had spent months preparing for was about to fall. And in his absence, the tragedy of his life would finally begin its descent toward the cyanide. History is often decided by minutes, and for Erwin Rommel, the minutes of June 6, 1944 were a death sentence. At 6 a.m., the telephone in his quiet German home rang. It was his chief of staff, Hans Speidel. The message was short. The invasion has begun. Rommel felt the world tilt. For months, he had predicted this moment, built his wall for this moment, and warned his Führer for this moment. And at the exact second, the Allied armada appeared through the Normandy mist. The man who was supposed to stop them was in his slippers, 300 miles away. The frantic drive back to France was a race through a graveyard. As Rommel looked out the window of his car, he didn't see the familiar French countryside. He saw a landscape dominated by the roar of Allied engines. The sky, once German, now belonged to the enemy. Every bridge was a ruin, every road a death. The Desert Fox was returning to a battle that was already lost when Rommel finally reached the front. The reality was worse than his darkest premonitions. He stood on the cliffs of La Roche-Guyon and looked out at the English Channel. It was an industrial miracle of God. Thousands of ships, an endless supply line that stretched back to the horizon, were pouring men and steel onto the soil of France. Rommel turned to his officers and said, "Look at that. We can't even move a single division in the daylight, and they are bringing a new army ashore every hour. The German army, the finest fighting machine of the 20th century, was being smothered by sheer weight." Rommel saw his panzer divisions, the pride of his life, being turned into scrap, metal by a navy they couldn't see, and an air force they couldn't touch. In that moment, the soldier in him died. He knew that any further resistance was no longer war. It was murder. He began to prepare his ultimate report for Hitler. The war must be ended. July 17th, 1944, a hot, humid afternoon near the village of Louvain. Rommel was returning from a meeting with his commanders, his mind heavy with the decision to finally confront Hitler. Suddenly, the scream of engines filled the car. 2 British Spitfires, hunting for high-value targets, spotted the staff car. They dived. Machine gun fire raked the road, the bullets tearing through the steel and glass. The driver was killed instantly. The car veered wildly, hitting a tree and somersaulting into a field. Rommel was thrown from the vehicle, his head smashing against the road. He lay in the dust, his skull fractured in 3 places, his face a mask of blood. The Desert Fox had survived 2 world wars, the heat of the Sahara and the fire of the Atlantic Wall, only to be broken by a nameless pilot on a quiet country road. As he was rushed to a field hospital, the conspirators in Berlin were making their final preparations. The man who was supposed to lead the new Germany was now a ghost, hovering between life and death. Rommel awoke in a world of pain and paranoia. His skull was held together by wire and willpower. One eye was swollen shut, and the left side of his face was paralyzed. But while his body was shattered, his mind was sharp enough to realize that the end was near. 3 days after his crash, a bomb exploded in Hitler's headquarters at the Wolf's Lair. The July 20th plot, the desperate attempt by Claus von Stauffenberg to kill the tyrant, had failed. Hitler had survived with minor injuries, and his rage was boundless. A blood purge began that would consume thousands of German officers. From his hospital bed, Rommel listened to the news on the radio. He heard the names of his friends, his colleagues, and his mentors being read aloud as traitors and criminals. He knew that the Gestapo would eventually come for him. He was no longer a hero. He was a loose end in a regime that was tearing itself apart. The investigation into the plot was a masterpiece of terror. Under the brutal tortures of the Gestapo, men began to talk. They spoke of the secret meetings, the whispers in the library, and the silent approval of the field marshal. Hitler was devastated. He had loved Rommel like a son, but in the twisted logic of a dictator, Rommel's treason was the greatest betrayal of all. Hitler couldn't believe his golden boy, the hero he had built with his own propaganda, had turned against him. But the evidence was mounting. A letter from Rommel to Hitler, written just before the crash, urged the Führer to face the reality of defeat. To Hitler, reality was a form of treason. The order was given. Rommel must be eliminated. But he couldn't be executed like a common criminal. The Desert Fox was too popular. The German public would revolt. The murder had to be a tragedy. By October 1944, Rommel had been allowed to return home to Herrlingen to recover. He was a shell of a man, his strength drained by his injuries and the constant fear of the Gestapo. He spent his days sitting in his garden, watching the autumn leaves fall, waiting for the sound of a car. He knew his house was watched. He knew his phone was tapped. He told his son, Manfred, "Hitler is going to kill me. He can't afford to let me live." The Desert Fox was no longer hunting. He was the prey, caught in a trap of his own making. He had tried to save Germany by staying silent, and now that silence was going to cost him his life. On October 14th, the staff car finally arrived. Two generals, Bergdorf and Meisel, sent by Hitler himself, knocked on the door. They didn't come with handcuffs. They came with an ultimatum. Rommel was given a choice that only a monster could devise: a public trial for treason, which would end in his execution and the persecution of his family, or a quiet suicide. If he took the cyanide, Hitler promised a state funeral, a hero's legacy, and safety for his wife and son. Rommel didn't hesitate. He chose his family over his life, and the myth over the man. He put on his old Afrika Korps uniform, picked up his baton, and walked out to the car. The Night of the Sands was going to his final battle, where the only way to win was to die. The air in Herrlingen on October 14th was thin and brittle, tasting of the coming winter and the decay of a dying empire. Erwin Rommel walked toward the black staff car with the measured pace of a man who had already seen his own ghost. Just minutes before, in the privacy of his study, he had told his wife and son the truth. "I will be dead in a quarter of an hour." There were no theatrics, no desperate pleas for a way out. Rommel understood the machinery of the Third Reich better than any man alive. He knew that once the Führer Eslov turned to vengeance, there was no court, no appeal, and no mercy. He chose the cyanide because he was, above all else, a protector. He died to ensure that his wife would not be sent to a camp, and that his son would not be branded the child of a traitor. As he settled into the back seat of the Mercedes between Generals Bergdorf and Meisel, the Desert Fox was entering the only battle he could not win through maneuver or speed. He was a passenger in his own execution. The car moved silently through the winding roads of the Swabian Alps, away from the prying eyes of the public. Inside, the silence was a physical weight. Bergdorf and Meisel, the men Hitler had sent to kill his favorite general, sat like statues of cold iron. They didn't look at Rommel. They didn't speak to him. They represented the banality of the regime men, who followed orders to murder a hero with the same professional indifference as if they were filing a supply report. Rommel looked out the window at the German countryside he had once fought to expand. He likely thought of the sands of Libya, the heat of the sun, and the clean, honest violence of the Afrika Korps. He saw the contrast between the warrior he had been and the victim he had become. The car slowed as it reached a quiet, wooded lane. Meisel and the driver stepped out, leaving Rommel alone with Bergdorf and the small, blue glass vial. In that forest, 5 miles from his home, the Desert Fox bit down on the glass. The end was not cinematic. It was mechanical. Cyanide does not allow for last words or heroic gestures. It is a chemical shutdown of the soul. When the driver returned to the car 5 minutes later, he found the field marshal slumped over, his cap fallen to the floor, his face already turning a waxy, translucent grey. The man who had outmaneuvered the British Empire and survived the Spitfires of Normandy was gone, reduced to a legal problem that needed to be managed. Meisel and Bergdorf didn't feel remorse. They felt relief. The loose end had been tied. They drove the body to a hospital in UMM, where a doctor was ordered to list the cause of death as a cerebral embolism resulting from his previous injuries. The lie was born before the body was even cold. Hitler had his hero back, but only because the man was dead. What followed was the most grotesque theatre in the history of Nazi Germany. Hitler ordered a day of national mourning. He gave Rommel the grandest state funeral of the war, a spectacle of Wagnerian proportions. The propaganda machine went into overdrive, painting Rommel as a martyr who had died from the wounds he received while defending the fatherland. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, who likely suspected the truth, was forced to deliver the eulogy, praising the loyalty and brilliance of a man the state had just murdered. Hitler himself did not attend, but he sent a massive wreath, a wreath that sat atop the casket of the man he had forced to commit suicide. It was the ultimate Nazi victory. They had killed the man, but they kept his legend to serve the very cause he had tried to stop. For the rest of the war, Lucy and Manfred Rommel lived in a house of ghosts. They were honored by the state, receiving a pension and visits from high-ranking officials, but they lived under the constant, suffocating watch of the Gestapo. They were a family trapped in a gold-plated cage, forced to play along with the lie that Rommel had died a hero of the regime. Lucy, a woman of immense strength, kept the secret locked behind her teeth, knowing that a single word of the truth would mean their execution. She watched as her husband's name was used to recruit more boys to die in a war that Rommel knew was lost. She saw the Desert Fox become a ghost that haunted the German people, a hero built on a foundation of cyanide and silence. The Nazi lie held until the very end. But like the 1,000-year Reich, it was eventually crushed by the weight of reality. After the surrender in 1945, as the camps were opened and the secrets of the Gestapo were spilled onto the streets, the truth about Rommel's death began to emerge. Lucy and Manfred finally spoke, their testimonies breaking the spell Goebbels had cast. The world learned that the Desert Fox hadn't died in a hospital bed from a stroke. He had died in a back seat because he was the only man Hitler feared as a rival for the heart of the German people. The revelation transformed Rommel again, shifting him from a Nazi icon to a symbol of the good German, the soldier who tried to maintain his honor in a world of monsters. History has been kind to Erwin Rommel, perhaps kinder than he deserved. We remember the Desert Fox as the chivalrous commander, the knight of the sands who fought a clean war. But the true tragedy of Rommel is not found in his battles. It is found in the trap he was caught in. He was a man who tried to be just a soldier, believing he could serve a criminal regime without becoming a criminal himself. He discovered too late that there is no such thing as a war without hate when you serve a man who is defined by it. Erwin Rommel was Hitler's favorite general until he became Hitler's greatest fear, and in the end, the poison that killed him was not just the cyanide in the vial, but the very myth he had allowed the state to build around his name.